I was looking at the Planning Act. I mean, that's something that we do periodically, and it states that effective regional planning requires cooperation among the federal, state, and local governments, and that that one of NCPC's role is to facilitate that cooperation. And so that's part of this is our effort to engage our local partners in helping make the National Capital Region a better place, both for the federal government and for the people who live and work here. The Agents of Change events are intended to explore how we can all do a better job of that. The first Agents of Change event at GSA focused on the evolving federal workplace and its influence on local communities. It was more of a policy discussion. Tonight, I think we're going to look more at the issue from the local perspective, focusing on real examples. And so we've asked the planning directors of the District of Columbia, the City of Alexandria, and Montgomery County to come and tell us about how that's working in their own communities. We hope that we'll get information out of this that will also inform the federal urban design element that NCPC staff is currently working on. There's information about our work on that element on our website if you are interested. We were hoping that we could say that this was the first time we'd gotten these three people together on one stage. I found out that we were wrong. That happened last fall, but it was a real estate organization that was sponsoring it, and it cost a lot of money. So we can say it was the first. This is the first free one, and I hope you appreciate your tax dollars at work. Since we've included bios of our panelists, I'm going to skip our formal introductions. But again, we have Harriet Dragoning from the District of Columbia, Rollin Stanley from Montgomery County, and Farrell Hamer from Alexandria. And the way we're going to work this is each of the planning directors is going to spend a little time talking about a project or the influence of the federal government in their own community. And then we're going to come up using slides, and then we're going to come up on stage and begin the discussion. So I'm just, with no further ado, I'm just going to turn this over to Farrell.
I thought today, hi, I'm Farrell Hamer. I'm the planning director from the City of Alexandria. I thought today, since we were given 3 minutes, I would focus on a single project. It's sort of a micro view in Alexandria, and the project is the PTO. And I think this is an interesting project because it demonstrates that even though you can have some what we would consider flaws in the urban design sort of best practices area, they can be overcome and compensated for. Because I think this project does have some important urban design flaws, but it also is an extremely, overall, it's a very successful project. So the message that I sort of want to carry today is that there's no formula. There's not 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things that you have to do in order to successfully integrate a federal project into your urban fabric and your urban activities. It's sort of mix and match, and each project is unique. So I'll start out with the PTO. You can see this is, just to orient you, the Masonic Memorial is on the top, and it lines up with King Street. Below that is Duke Street, and below that is the rail yards and the city landfill, and it's the rail yards and the city landfill where the PTO is located. So that was 1937. This was just taken about a year ago. In the green is the outline is the Carlisle area, which is actually part of a larger redevelopment area called Eisenhower East. And then the yellow line sort of shows where the 6 PTO buildings are. Okay. Oh, let me go back just a second. And the other thing that you can see is in the upper middle area, there's the King Street Metro, and on the lower left-hand side, just outside the green line, is the Eisenhower Metro. So it is within walking distance of 2 metro stations. This is a close-up of the buildings, and as you can see, there are actually 6 buildings here. It's 2.5 million square feet. There are 6 buildings that have identical footprints. 2 of the buildings in the back there are joined by an atrium, and there's 2 large parking garages flanking the buildings. So the buildings are joined by an atrium in the center and by underground walkways underneath. Okay, so that's the atrium from head on, and basically, it's, as I said, it's 2.5 million square feet. There's about 9,000 employees. It brings in about $9 million in taxes every year. It's a private building. It's leased by the Patent and Trade Office. There's 3,000 parking spaces, which comes out to about a parking space and a half per 1,000 square feet. And by the way, those garages are only ever about 85% full. And the atrium itself is about 202 feet tall, and the flanking buildings are about 130 to 150 feet. So that's the background. Here's some of the changes that happened to the plan. So this was the original plan. It was done by Cooper Robertson, and the whole area has about 75 acres and about 7 million square feet. And as you can see, the Delaney Gardens, which is right in the center, that narrow green strip, that street actually goes through all the way from Duke Street in the north to Eisenhower Avenue in the south. It had its retail clustered, and it had a fairly fine-grained mix of uses and parking garages either in the center or underground. What happened when the PTO came in is we had to revise the plan. One of the things that happened was it's a much larger single use now. Instead of a fine-grained mix of uses, the entire center of the plan is taken up with office. Residential is on the sides. The retail is more scattered. It's not as concentrated. And as you can see, the street no longer goes through. The grid is very important everywhere. We especially like it in Alexandria because we have Old Town, where the grid is it's small. These blocks are small, 240 by 360. The grid here is a little bit bigger. I think it's maybe 300 by 400, but we were not happy about having to close the street off to accommodate the PTO. And I'm going to talk about some ways. However, it could have been worse. The original building design is in the upper left-hand corner, and you can see it's a pretty monolithic. I mean, it really does block the street. What we ended up with is the atrium on the lower right, and the atrium, while it does block the street, it's glass. You can see through it. It's public, and you can actually see when you walk up those stairs, you can see all the way through to the street at the back. So there is, at least there's some porosity and some public access. In the upper right-hand corner, that is the George Washington National Masonic Memorial. It is it's patterned after the old Alexandria, Egypt library, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and that's what the atrium is patterned after. The garages, as I said, are freestanding. That's one of the that's one of the connections to the building. They do connect to the building. In the back, the garage is screened. It is not an active frontage on Eisenhower Avenue, so that was one of the flaws. It's screened, but it's not active. And on the 2 sides, there's 30-foot deep townhouses, office townhouses, a little activity, not a lot, but better than exposed garage. The Delaney, the frontage, the Delaney on Delaney Gardens, again, this was supposed to be all retail. It did end up, we did get a lot of glass and light precast concrete in there, so it's a little more contemporary look than the rest of the buildings, but there is not any retail there. There is a park, and there's a lot of other public activities that really compensate for this that I'll talk about later. This is another shot of the glass front, and below that, as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a concourse level that's lower down. It's the connecting halls that connect. They have a massive amount of mail, as you can imagine, in the PTO. They have to shuttle tremendous numbers of packages from one building to the other. So a lot of people spend their life in the hall taking these packages around, and they put the hall on the concourse level just below the glass windows in the front so that the halls are all daylit. This is the inside of the atrium. Again, another disappointing thing that happened was there's a cafeteria and a daycare center in the building. This meant that, you know, all the life wasn't going to spill out into the streets and use the local eateries and so on. So that was disappointing, but this is actually open to the public, and in fact, the public can use this for receptions and so on. I was here a week ago at something called Living Legends of Alexandria, and it's a great public space. This is just a shot of looking at it from the actual memorial, and as I said, so there are a lot of flaws. But there's a lot of really good things, and I'm hoping that as we go through the discussion, Christine is going to ask some questions, and I can talk to you about why this works so well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Roland.
Good afternoon, I'm Roland Stanley. I came to this country 10 years ago, and the first thing I had to learn was dealing with the federal government. Things tend to be a little more genteel and proper in Canada because all federal land is titled to the Queen. And I have been appealed to the courts by the Queen. I won. We exchange Christmas cards now, but she hasn't come over. But I'm going to give two examples. We apparently have to give the worst example, and I don't want to give one locally, so I'm going to give you one from my last job as planning director of the city of St. Louis. Is there a pointer on this?
There's a laser pointer. The pen right in front of you.
Ah, got it. So, this is the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. You know it as the St. Louis Arch. The key word is memorial. You cannot throw a baseball there. That's disrespectful. This is Interstate I-70. It's depressed. Like, I don't mean like depressed emotionally. It's actually physically depressed. And this is where I learned that what the height of a bridge is in America. You know what the height of a bridge over an interstate highway is determined by? The height of an M1 tank on a truck. Just so you know. So, the face of that memorial, owned by the National Park Service, fronting on the city of St. Louis downtown, is 1.1 miles. And they determined that they had to put, every 5 feet, 42-inch high, 10.5-inch diameter, 1,100 bollards all the way through there. Not to say that there's not a lake there and a lake here, which would be hard to traverse in a 3.5-ton truck, and there's lots of trees, but there are now 1,100 bollards right through there. And the former director of the Park Service, in a meeting when I said, is this for real? And I'm not going to swear, I'll leave a blank. She said the National Park Service doesn't give a blank about its interface with downtown St. Louis. Word for word. And I realized that it's hard to deal with the federal government. So, the funny part about it, though, is it was to stop because, have you ever been to this place? It's really quite cool. It's a spectacular thing, but the facility, the entry visitor center is below, right? But all you have to do, if I may, is go to the ends here, and you can watch the trains go right under it. And that includes trains with, like, gas. And there's no bollards to stop the trains. So you start to think, well, let me think now here for a moment. Am I going to take it down with a 3.5-ton truck, or am I just going to stand over here and do something to a train? I mean, the logic just seemed to escape me. But anyway. So here's what I'll talk about. Here's D.C. This is the interstate highway system, the new intercounty connector. And I'm going to talk about that big chunk of land right there on Colesville Road, just outside of the Beltway. And we're doing a master plan for this area now, and you'll see there Federal Research Center and FDA. FDA is planning to build 6 million square feet, have 9,000 employees. It covers 610 acres, and it's closed off to everything around it. There's a shopping mall here, a shopping mall here. We're trying to develop this land. There's shopping over here. So as we go through this master plan, so here's the Beltway, Colesville Road. The FDA sits right in there, next to the 10-mile creek watershed or whatever it's called. And we're sitting here trying to figure out how we can work our way, unfortunately, around this big chunk of land. And we're going to get, 20 million square feet out here and all this other stuff. And, of course, the big problem is the FDA is putting all these plays out there, and they're not doing anything for transit except for shuttle bus. So in Montgomery County, all our capacity is determined by road capacity, and if you don't have the road capacity, you can't build. And we have to factor in the road capacity eaten up by the federal government, even though they don't have to pay any of the mitigation or pay for any of the enhancements to the transportation system. So this is like the sponge in the bucket of water when we're trying to redevelop these other places. So, for example, here's the shopping mall where the Sears is at Colesville and New Hampshire, and we're trying to see, can we start to do something different there and fill it in, but right here is the big gap. And so it's a very isolated kind of a thing because we can't get into the federal lands and try and work out how can they be better integrated into what we're doing because nobody can drive across it, right? You can't go in. Now, their buildings are spectacular, but you can't go there. And of course, they're so deep into the site, nobody leaves to go have lunch anywhere. They're all on the federal campus. So the challenge for us is how we're going to deal with that. And we'll get into that as we ask questions. So I'll turn it over to Harriet.
Good evening, everyone. So I had such a wealth of choices to choose from in the District of Columbia for good and bad examples of federal design, and I sort of want to call out Mina Wright, who's the Director of Urban Design for the General Services Administration. And actually, I've got a good example that I want to show that Mina has some responsibility for. Not yet. Not yet. It's not your fault that it's not fully funded. But let me talk to you a little bit about this project, and Mina can jump in and correct me if I get anything wrong. This is GSA's headquarters building. It's downtown. It's bordered by, it's F Street, and is it 18th?
18th and F.
Okay, so you kind of know where that is, not too far from the White House. And it was formerly a level what security? 5?
It was, yeah, 5 because of size, I guess.
Yeah, so, you know what that means.
And location, a block from the White House.
For us, I mean, if it was a new installation, it would have 100 to 180-foot setback. It'd have bollards everywhere. Because it was an existing building, they still had a lovely line of bollards, but that was kind of the security designation. Like almost every other federal building in the city, the ground floors were inactive. There were services inside the building, but the public wasn't allowed to use those services. Those services were all inward facing. And so pretty much there was not much happening on the street. GSA did a couple of amazing things with this building, or is in the process of doing those things. One of the things that they're doing, which has larger implications, which we can talk about later, is that they're really doubling up, tripling up on the number of employees who use this building. They are doing a lot with the workplace in terms of accommodating a lot more employees. So it's if they get fully funded for this, both their regional office that is near L'Enfant Plaza will be able to be accommodated in this building along with the entire GSA headquarters. They're going to use hoteling, they're going to use flexible workplace and telecommuting. Basically, at the end of the day, every single employee will have a chair here, but they're not expected to be in it all the time. And the actual space that every employee is going to have is going to shrink dramatically. But among the things that they've done in this building, I didn't do that. Where our picture's gone. Okay, back again. Great. Among the things that they've done is that they've said something that is so stunningly reasonable that I still can't get over it. They basically said, you know what? Our secretary, the head of GSA is our administrative GSA. Her office maybe is a level 5 security, but you know what? There's a gradient of security needs for this building, and not every single person and every single activity needs to be protected at the highest level. And so they reduced the number of bollards around this building to something like 6, 3 in front of each of the 2 entrances that now are at the building, and nowhere else. And in the inside of the building, there's more security measures to protect the high security places, but they did something so stunningly rational that I fear it will never catch on among their colleagues in the federal government. So, but it's a very brilliant and important thing. Another thing that they did that's very cool. I'm trying to move this forward. Okay, this is retail. This is retail on E Street. That is actually open to the public. So they are allowing the building to be lined with retail uses that activate the street, that make it lively. They provide services for their employees, but they activate the street. They make a contribution, a positive contribution to the streetscape of the city. In addition, on an upper floor, I believe it is, there's a cafeteria that is also planned to be open to the public, so that even, even without a body cavity search, you would be able to go to the cafeteria and have a meal, and it would be part of the services that would be available, to Washingtonians by virtue of this building being here, which I think is so civilized and so wonderful. Let us contrast that with many examples that we could have. But is this not everyone's favorite example? The FBI. Come on your hit parade. How many would have voted for the FBI as the worst building in the city? HUD. No, HUD. I gotta say, no. HUD is a plaza. Where people can sit, and you probably won't get run off. And it was designed. This not quite so much. I mean, not only is it really foreboding in its appearance and blocked off, they also don't let you park in front of it. You can't even put a car anywhere around the building unless you're an FBI related use. So they've kind of come out beyond the curb, to further affect kind of how the city works, and they've got all these lovely double rows of bollards. I mean, the practical effect is actually it's kind of a nice broad place to walk in between, although there's nothing, you would never pause there. So it's nice to walk if you're going, if it's along your way, but you have a different destination. But it's a building that I have to say doesn't make a positive contribution to the, to the street life, to the city in many ways. And so I would name 4 things that in particular I think are principles that we'd want to look for, that GSA has set some great examples of. A much more sensible approach to security, right? We can be much more sophisticated about what we need to address security threats and yet contribute to the public realm. The second thing is activate those inactive first floors. A lot of these buildings have uses that are actually active uses, whether they're libraries, nurseries. Some of them have, some buildings have stores. Many of them have cafeterias. They sometimes have other services like dry cleaning and repair shops and all kinds of other stuff. Those things should be outside, on the first floor, if not actually allowing other types of retail uses to exist there. These buildings, by their nature, especially ones like this, are single-use buildings, which is not, the best thing. We'd like to see multi-use buildings, at least with retail. We'd have multiple uses. But the other bad thing in some parts of the city is that they agglomerate to single-use precincts, right? So that you have blocks and blocks where there's only office and very little retail. And the retail that's there is what I'd call subsistence retail, the stuff that can survive by offering lunch, and a few services. Like, people aren't staying down there for dinner because, why? No one lives down there, and there's often no other destination that would bring people down after work. So figuring out ways to distribute what is a great thing, federal office workers, around the city in a different way that allows us to mix the uses. Our most successful neighborhoods in all of our communities have that mix of uses, have that activity that gives you at least 18 hours of use and allows a much more robust set of other activities to be there. I think we're ready whenever you are now. Thank you.
Farrell, I'd like to start. You had mentioned something about the Patent and Trademark Office, that there were some good things and some. Oh, I'm sorry. I have one. It's not positioned correctly. Try to get that. Okay, is that better? So you had said, Farrell, that at the Patent and Trademark Office there were some good things and some bad things. And actually, when we talked over the phone, you had said that good urbanism has rules, and this one broke some and didn't break some. And I thought I'd ask you to talk about that a little bit more.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So one of the
By the way, how many people work at the PTO?
Well, I think it's about 9,000 now. Okay. Not that they're there. They have a lot of telecommuting, but I think there's like 9,000 right now. And actually, one of the better things about the PTO It's not an urban design issue, but they are generally fee-funded. They're not dependent on federal appropriations. So this is very helpful. And it does really matter which agencies you have, what kind of workers there are. There are a lot of attorneys. They have a lot of spending power. And the fact that they're fee-funded. And the PTO is still expanding, which is great. One of the few federal agencies that's still looking for more office space. But as far as the urban design goes, one of the big things that, of course, we look for is street activation and public space and public activity. So even though there's not retail there, what there is, as I said, the atrium itself is open to the public. Anybody can eat in the cafeteria. This is really wonderful. And they have a public park. The park has Wi-Fi in it. A lot of the workers go outside and use the park. They have sort of glass columns in the park that are lit up at night, and they have LED colors that change with the seasons or with holidays and so on, or just change colors. They have, they do actually have a couple of delis, a credit union, a fitness center. The fitness center is private, but you can see it through the window, so you can actually walk by and watch people exercise, something I always enjoy. And so in spite of the fact that there's not that retail there, there is a lot of public activity and a lot of porosity of the buildings. And because there are so many different buildings and all the buildings have different entrances, there are people walking in and out all the time.
Who pays for the free lunchtime shuttle?
The city of Alexandria.
And no subsidy, federal, not people?
I don't believe so. I'm not 100% sure.
How well is that being used now?
It's actually very popular. I should say that, so this is called the lunch bus, and it takes people from the PTO to King Street, where there are a lot of restaurants, a lot of variety of restaurants. The other thing that happens, interestingly, and it's something that Harriet brought up, the single-use district. So there is a lot of office space there, and while there's quite a bit of residential too, it tends to be a lot deader at night. And one of the reasons why it is dead is that people actually can walk to King Street, and there's a lot of restaurants and a lot of retail on King Street. So it's sort of both a blessing and a problem.
I'd like to follow that up with a question for Harriet. Harriet, the Patent and Trademark Office is leased space, and I know in the district, the Department of Transportation is a leased facility that the district had a lot of opportunity to work with the developer to get some things done. But you've also got a lot of stuff that is built by the government, for the government. Do you find that it's easier or worse to work with the government in lease space or in owned space?
Well, I think that for a lot of reasons, I have a strong love of leased space because that building is on the tax rolls. And in the District of Columbia, more than 40% of all the land is off the tax rolls. So to have something on the tax rolls is actually quite nice, for the city. So I do have, design notwithstanding, I like things that are on the tax rolls. I think if you were to compare what Mina is doing with the GSA headquarters, Mina, Bob Peck, Martha Johnson, with what we were able to get at the JBG building that was built to the specifications of USDOT, we got a paltry Starbucks, a single, and that building is more than 2 blocks long. And there's a single retail use that's accessible from the outside, and you can't get to it from the inside. So I think what Mina's doing with GSA is much better for, in an urban design sense, much better for the public realm activating the street. Now, part of it might have to do with the timing, because that USDOT building was leased much closer to 9/11. And I think before, we were really ready to say, we can apply, more judicious, more nuanced standards of security. So I think that has something to do with it. But, I'd have to say that, there are really good and really bad examples both with owned and leased space, and the federal buildings are not all GSA buildings. And I think that one of the difficulties for us as public officials is it does seem sometimes like there isn't really any rhyme or reason about security measures and why things are a certain way, whether it's parking and how much parking might be associated with a given building, or whether it's security measures, or whether it's the willingness to have retail on the first floor, and that that makes it difficult. It's a sort of a new negotiation every time.
Roland, I think that in Montgomery County, some of these buildings that we've just been talking about are single buildings, but Montgomery County has a lot of campuses. You've got NIH, you've got the Bethesda, Walter Reed Naval Medical Center, you've got White Oak. Do you think that, is there hope for federal campuses and being good urban neighbors? And if so, what are there things that the federal government is doing right in those locations? Is there something that the federal government could be doing better?
No. I'm teasing. There's a bit of a difference in the sense that, or at least what I've been told, is if you want to blow things up and work with the federal government, you're on the west side of the Potomac. If you want to do food-related things and health, you're on the east side of the Potomac. So we're optimistic with some conflicts ending that there'll be more money coming to the east side of the Potomac. And it varies by institution. So, for example, NRC has just topped out their new building at 300 feet at the White Flint Metro stop, and the garage is in the building below grade. The NIH building, the garage is separate, and it's just down a little ways away, and it's got to be able to withstand blast, and they wouldn't combine them. So it seems it depends on who you're dealing with, which is surprising. Harriet's point about lease space is a good one in the context of being able to have more control over what happens relative to the design of a building, because if it's a private sector developer, they've got to go through the regular channels. If it's the federal government, we don't get to say very much. The optimism is that they're exploring ways in which to make things better. So, for example, with the BRAC base reallocation in Bethesda, there's been a 46% increase in carpooling. It's like off the charts. People are shocked. The traffic mayhem has not evolved. People are not running down the street setting themselves on fire because they can't get through. And it's really a shocking result. And that's with minimal transportation improvements in effect today. Enhancements at the subway, etc. So there is a lot of hope about shifts in the way people think. And when the new proposal calls have come out recently, they're asking for them to be near transit, which is also good, but that is also limiting our ability to respond to things like that. So yeah, it's getting better.
Well, Farrell, that gives us the obvious opening to talk about the Mark Center. There was lots of the sky is falling about what was going to happen when the Mark Center opened up, and now we're a while in.
The Mark Center, while in many ways a complete disaster as far as urban design and security and a lot of other things, it also was, I think, exactly what we had the exact situation that Roland's talking about. It was expected to create total gridlock. And transportation was probably the #1 issue that was on the community's mind when they were thinking about the bad effects of that building. And so it's been open for a while now. They have about 3/4 of the people there. I think it's 4,800 people are in the building, but only 3,300 show up every day. The parking spaces are capped at 2,000 right now, thanks to Congressman Moran, and but there's only 1,400 or 1,500 spaces that are used every day. So there's about a 50% transit use. And there is a big transit hub that was built there. There's dozens of shuttles every day, very short headways that go to all of the metro stations, and there's three or four different bus lines that actually run through there. So I would have to agree that there's hope in the sense that the emphasis that the federal government is putting on transit ridership and other non-SOV ways to get to work is great.
One of the questions from a member of the from someone here was, were there specific design guidelines that the city of Alexandria asked the Department of Defense to implement at the Mark Center?
Yes, there were, and we had some limited success.
And could you tell us like what some of those were?
We had issues with the design of the building. The windows were incredibly tiny, and we insisted that the windows be larger, that there be an interesting cap on the top of the building. It was just completely a box. We asked for a bunch of ground level sort of landscape and access walkway improvements. We asked for improvements to the transit center so that the long wall there would have some. We asked them to put some art on the wall, which they're doing. So it's a few things like that.
Would you say those Beauregard small area plans and the Hamer is a result of now BRAC, because it is privately owned and the city is not going to be receiving any tax dollars from BRAC? The city is now pushing for, similar to Montgomery County, the Beauregard small area plan that encircles that area where there is no metro, major transportation traffic.
Well, actually, thank you for bringing that up. One of the things that has been on the... Oh, sorry. There's a discussion about the relationship of the small area plan for Beauregard, which surrounds the BRAC building, transit, and the relationship of BRAC to the Beauregard plan. One of the things that actually has been planned by the city for a while is 3 rapid transit corridors, and one of those corridors does go north and south on Beauregard Street, right past the BRAC building. So that's in the planning stages, but we're pushing very hard to make that a reality.
I'm curious, Roland, you said that at White Oak that the only thing that they were doing about reducing the amount of parking was renting shuttles. Farrell, you said that the shuttles at the PTO were provided by the city of Alexandria. I'm sort of curious I'll sort of throw this out to anybody who wants to talk about how you've been working that, or is that typically something that the agency pays for, or is it something that the local government has been willing to foot, or actually we have someone here from WMATA, if they're, I don't know, to the extent that our local transit agencies have been willing to work with governments on that. How does that work?
FDA pays for it, but there's a citizens group that works closely with the FDA about how their site develops and is working, and they help, plan where the shuttles go and all those kinds of things, but FDA pays for it in that case.
And so it's not available to anybody, it's not available to the public?
I've never tried to ride it, so I assume not. All I know is whenever I go there, I got to bring my passport and my green card, so I'm guessing they won't let me on.
That's actually a really good point. I mean, we're talking a lot about the redevelopment of St. Elizabeth's, which will bring 14,000 plus people to employees of the Department of Homeland Security to the St. Elizabeth's campus. And because the 2 metro stations that are on either side are sort of not as proximate as would be ideal, DHS is planning on running a shuttle, and they expect to have a lot of visitors, 2,000 a day, but we've been having spirited conversations about who can be on the shuttle. I mean, clearly people are going to be screened before they go into the building, but the initial posture of DHS was that they only wanted DHS employees with government IDs to be able to be on the shuttle, which meant that would encourage people to drive, because if you came by metro, you'd have an incredibly long walk, even as you could wave at the people going by in the shuttle. So not to mention neighborhood folks who might want to go to some of the retail and other amenities. So I think having maybe some different ideas about the community benefit of these paratransit services would be really helpful. 2 good things both about the Mark Center and about at least the plan for the FEMA building is that they've done at least one good thing, which is to put the parking outside the security perimeter. Because on so many of the federal plans that we see, the government agencies treat the privately owned cars of federal workers as precious as the building or the workers themselves, even though they're not up for protecting those cars when they're parked in the employee's home, or somewhere else. But once they get near the workplace, they suddenly want to treat them as if they're level 5. They have a level 5 security need to protect the automobile, which I don't I totally don't understand that. So not happening at the Marx Center, also not happening for the FEMA building, but certainly happening at dozens of other federal installations around the region.
There is the underground parking at the Marks Center and the private surface parking at the Marks Center.
Well, that actually makes me think, because several of you have mentioned parking garages at federal facilities that aren't fully used. I know that NCPC has policies in the comprehensive plan that encourage federal agencies to keep down the level of parking that they provide to their employees, that are often more restrictive than what is required by the local government. And I'd like to know if the federal agencies are actually providing more parking than their employees need, what's driving that? Is that by the tenants who are requiring it? Is that
Well, let me take a crack at that, because I actually think, I mean, for example, the PTO, it was only 1.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet, which is already a very low number for office, even if it is between 2 metro stations. And the fact that PTO actually does allow the public to park in those garages, and I think it's partly because of the security issue. They're separated by a good 60 feet from the building itself. So there's really not a big security issue there. So, but they're still only about 85% filled. And I think the reason is that people are changing their habits, and it's happening anyway. I mean, I think the transit subsidies from the federal government help a lot, but I think it's happening anyway. We're certainly seeing in residential developments that people are self-selecting and more people are choosing to ride transit. Younger people are less interested in cars. They're not as identified with cars as some of us used to be when we were growing up. And I think people's habits and expectations are changing.
Again, it gets back to what we were talking about whether the government's building it or it's being built by a private contractor. Because if the government's building it, they may provide less parking, but if it's a private contractor, they have to think beyond the government. And so in order for them to get financing, often they can't get lending unless they're providing a lot of parking spaces. And so they're not just thinking about the next 10 years, they're thinking about the lifespan of the building. So often what you might see is that the garage is very large to cater to the standard that the banks think that they need to finance that building. And one thing that has to happen, certainly here, is that the banks have to be educated about this kind of thing, because it really does impact it. Now in St. Louis, we had no parking requirements in the downtown, but all the federal buildings had massive garages. And that's because everybody was driving from the suburbs to get there.
I'm not, I don't doubt that developers tell us, I've certainly heard it, that they can't get a project financed. I have yet to actually have a bank tell me that. I've actually yet to have that statement kind of proven. So I'm a little bit, I'm skeptical about it, but I do think that you know, kind of the obligation is on us to challenge those assumptions, and also to recognize that, you know, whatever, you know, at any moment, you know, that you're talking about development, we're in the middle of some trend or another. You know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was the trend of increasing driving and parking, but the opposite is now the case. And I think it's pretty interesting from the federal government's perspective in particular. I sometimes hear something referred to called a silver tsunami, which is the aging of the federal workforce. And that, you know, they're expecting a significant percentage of the workforce to kind of turn over as people retire. And that, you know, what the expectations are for the people who would take the place of the retirees is pretty different, especially if they're in the millennial generation. I think that's part of why the timing for GSA's initiative with kind of a next generation workplace is, you know, is a good one, because for a lot of young people, flexibility in their workplace, the ability to work from home, the ability, you know, their prestige is not a big office. You know, it's other kinds of freedom and flexibility, and it's certainly true that in our region, you know, we've been very successful attracting young people with college degrees, and part of the reason I think they're attracted to our region is that we really have a lot of great transit services, beginning with WMATA. and the transit, Metro Rail and Metro Bus that's provided. This is literally a region where you can live without having to own a car. And if you come out of school burdened with more college debt than there's credit card debt in this country, that's very, very appealing to you, to be able to live in a place where you could be without a car and pay off your student loans twice as fast. So I think that's helping to set some new norms in our region that mean that we're changing a bit faster than the rest of the country, and I think it's good. It means we're not going to be wasting money spending $40,000 or $50,000 for a structured parking space that we don't need.
But see, there's a big difference between where Harriet works and then where I work, and it's huge. And I used to have a bumper sticker after 21 years doing planning in Toronto that said I don't do suburbs. I do suburbs now, and recently I've been regretting it. However, the one thing I had to learn is, I come from the land where you have no idea Toronto's building a 30-story, 300-unit condo right now with no parking. Okay, Toronto's so far ahead of everybody else is not funny. But that doesn't work in Montgomery County. And you have to be very careful because you have a DOT who want 3 turning lanes onto local roads. And they have standards that require 3 turning lanes to local roads. And we're doing White Flint now, and you've probably seen the plans for it. And the plan calls for 90-foot roads, and DOT wants 160 feet. And it's a challenge. And what happens is when the private sector goes in, and regardless of who they're building the building for, the DOT holds the final card. And eventually the JBGs of the world just give up. And it's unfortunate, and we're making progress. But the other side of this is people will drive there. Yes, you have the red line going through, but try to get to the red line. And yes, we're planning a 150-mile or 100-mile BRT route, but it's still not going to get into 40% of the county, which is single-family homes. People will drive.
So why did JBG give up?
They want to start building. Oh, why did JBG give up? They gave up on some of the things because they want to build. They've been negotiating for months.
What do you see as the sort of the future for federal development? I think that we have this ideal that new federal facilities can serve as anchors for new development. I think that we like to point to, for instance, the DOT headquarters or the in Southwest or the ATF headquarters in Noma, but I don't see that there's a lot of new money coming down the pike to build new federal facilities. And also, there is an issue where as land becomes more expensive close to transit, the federal government may be priced out of the market, to be frank. So, and given what Harriet said earlier about, wanting tenants that pay taxes, is that even what you want at the transit facilities in your communities? Or would you rather have, the big tax-paying tenants in those locations?
Okay, well, NOAA's right at the Silver Spring Metro. I mean, literally, you can throw a baseball to somebody going by on the train. It's built right up to the street for the most part, but they did some creative things with their wave pool, the public art component to act as, the crash barriers and all that kind of stuff. But they pay taxes. They don't own the building. Now, the problem is when they come up for renewal, what does the county have to do to keep them there? So HHS, which has like 3 million square feet, we just gave $19 or $18 million in subsidy to over 15 years to stay in the building. So even if it's a private sector building and they're paying taxes, and the employees are there, who hopefully live in the county, are paying an income tax, sometimes you're offsetting by giving the tax breaks to keep them there. The other thing we have to think about, and I think there may be some backlash over a time period, is as the federal government retrenches in their leasing, the owners of those buildings have to think about what they're going to do after the federal government. And I think what we're going to start to see is some more flexibility in what's happening, because the owners who are providing the space are saying, I've got to lease this building after you go. It's got a longer lifespan, and I've got needs to meet as well.
Yeah, I think that, yes, of course, we all would rather have leased buildings. And one of the things that the examples in the PTO was that it was Elcor who built the building, and the city actually had quite a bit of leverage negotiating, and they actually put a condition in that it's a 20-year lease with an option for the federal government to buy at any time. If that occurs, it's a covenant that's written into the land records that the owner actually has to pay the city of Alexandria the difference in the taxes. So, however, the city is generally averse to subsidizing those kinds of deals. So that's a little bit of a hardship. But also, I think the federal government, it's not just the federal government, offices everywhere are going to retrench. Everybody's consolidated. The federal government is in many ways in the forefront of workplace innovation and hoteling and all that kind of stuff. But I see offices everywhere doing that. And so I think all the jurisdictions are going to be very hard put to balance budgets with less and less new office space coming online for a long time.
The only caveat I would say to this is that I think every day metro access, increases in terms of its premium, whether it's to live near it, whether it's to work near it, and that's without any enormous increase in energy prices. If we get that, I mean, it'll become even more important. So I think that locations that are near metro and being able to accommodate more workers and more residents near metro, I think is still very much a winning formula for our region, and something that we can supplement. I mean, I think each of our jurisdictions is contemplating additional types of transit services that key off of metro but augment them, whether it's bus rapid or light rail in Montgomery County. Certainly for us, it's streetcar, but also our capital bike share system that you're familiar with that really does extend people's basically the transit commute shed, and that's how it's proposed to be used in Rockville and some other places. But those are things where we could take this asset that we've already paid for and make a lot more of it and give a lot more people and businesses that access to metro that enables them to, even if they have a car, to use it less, to pay less for it, to cause less congestion on the road, to have more money in their pocket to do other things. All good for our region.
And in DC, wouldn't you say the circulator bus has really proven to be quite good?
If you could hold off your questions simply because the other people can't hear them.
Well,
So
I'll just say
take
the
up more comments.
the lady in the front asked, am I grateful for the circulator bus? I am. It does a very good job of providing what we like to call premium transit service, 10-minute service to many, many parts of the city, and we are looking forward to some expansions of that service.
I'd just like to ask a question about security. Roland, you mentioned that at the NOAA headquarters that they'd done a good job with the way they'd incorporated security into the fountain in the front of the building. We still have some places where we've got the ugly planters and bollards, but my sense is that agencies are becoming more sensitive to the way that they are incorporating that into their building yards and streetscapes. Is that your experience?
Yeah, well, we have a courthouse in Alexandria that's actually very close to the PTO building, and it's been very instructive because for a long time they had Jersey barriers in the street, and half the street was blocked off and you couldn't travel it at all, and the other half was just sort of one lane, and there was a sally port, which was a little piece of the street created by the Jersey barriers. And we've been having discussions with, 2 or 3 years with the U.S. Marshal's Office about how to make the courthouse more attractive. The courthouse was originally donated, that land was donated by the developer as the Carlisle area was being built, because the concept was that in Virginia many courthouses sort of create public space and they're the first thing in the town, and they stimulate other development, and so that's what this was supposed to be, is this great civic space, which had pretty much been eaten up by the Jersey barriers. So we've been working with them for several years, and at one point the Marshal's Office idea was to create red brick-covered Jersey barriers. And we have finally, I think, come to a wonderful agreement where they've got this sort of old style, it looks like a garden fence, like a metal garden fence. It's lovely, but it's like security enforced. It's very triple whatever steel. I don't know all the technical terms for it, but it actually is pretty attractive, and it just sort of sits right on the lawn. The Jersey barriers will be completely gone. They don't need the Sally port anymore. So at least in some cases, there seems to be more sensitivity.
I'm a big fan of the security measures at the local post office.
I would just say that I think that the federal agencies in general are more responsive to the input from the public and from the reviewing agencies and the planning office and the National Capital Planning Commission and others that to basically continue to say, does it have to serve just a single function? Yes, I get that you have to have security, but I would love it if you would reconsider how much security you need. But does it have to be ugly? I mean, could it be seating? Could it be built into the landscape so that it's not so obvious? Could it be part of some other decorative feature? And I think we're seeing more and more of that, but I honestly, we hardly ever see it with the first proposal. We usually see something horrifying with the first proposal, and then, there's a reaction, and then we get something better. It just seems like it really requires a lot of vigilance to move the quality of the design so that you get something that I think our public spaces deserve, our democracy deserves.
There's also the realism aspect of it. I showed you the pictures of the 1,100 bollards at the arch. So they installed those, and a couple months later, we were down at the waterfront in front of the arch, and the arch is right there. And we're with the park rangers talking about the waterfront, and all of a sudden you hear a plane. And we look up, clear blue sky, and we see this plane circle around the south end of town. And he lined up the two legs of the arch, and he flew straight at it. Now, you're not allowed to do this. In fact, it's 10 years in jail, apparently. And the plane comes straight towards the legs of the arch. The last minute, the guy realizes he's too low and goes whoosh, over the top of it. And the rangers are running around looking for cameras, And the plane goes around the federal government building, comes around. Be damned if he didn't do it again. And so the rangers immediately get in the car and they're driving over to the local airport to wait for the guy to land. But you stop and think. You got the train going under it. You got the planes going over it. And you got 1,100 bollards in front of it. And I'm thinking, come on.
I also think that I remember somebody telling me once that a bollard with all the structure underneath of it was $5,000 or $8,000, and so if you've got all those bollards, I figured it was like $5 or $8 million. So
I actually know the answer to that, but if I tell you it, I'm liable to be killed, apparently.
Okay.
Or deported. Or deported.
I'd like to take a moment to see if a couple of people have brought cards up to the front. Does anybody else have any question cards? Is there questions? Somebody will come around and pick them up if you'll hold them up.
Anybody else have a card?
We got some cards over here. I'd like to know if y'all have any questions you would like to ask each other. That you're
related to this subject?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Are y'all dealing with similar sorts of problems, or are some of your problems unique to your jurisdiction?
Can I ask a similar question to my colleagues about their favorite and least favorite federal public space, not the building, but the space? It might be a park, it might be some other kind of facility. I think for you it is that you've answered the question for St. Louis, but locally, is there a space that you like or don't like, and why?
I'm not going to say whether I like it or not. Those rocks in front of the NRC building at the White Flint Metro are really attractive. It reminds me of being back home in Northern Ontario.
I think we're getting a sense of whether you like it or not, actually.
I just drove by this. I know what you mean. Oh my God. Nothing.
Well,
Rock Creek Park. I love Rock Creek
Rock Creek Park is totally beautiful. So we have how many people have been to the National Gallery of Art's Sculpture Garden? Isn't that kind of a sublime space? So I find it so odd that everything that they do in that space, from program it to sell food to have, basically 4 seasons of use, in Farragut Square and McPherson Square and Franklin Square, that they can't seem to do any of those things. Now, admittedly, one is under the jurisdiction of the National Gallery and one of them is under the jurisdiction of the Park Service. But they're both federal. Like, why would one agency have a set of rules that would create one of the most beautiful public spaces in America and the other one labor under a set of rules that, that give you quite the opposite? Anyone have an answer? I'm really curious about this.
Culture.
Culture.
The great things that are being done around America are always because they're partnerships. The Park Service has never wanted to partner with the private sector. And if you go to New York or Chicago or Boston, you see all these great public spaces. But it's all because of the interaction between the private and the public sector. And I think once the Park Service begin to realize that partnership is really a key element of getting a better job. I spent 5 years working in bid trying to get downtown parks to do all the things you just talked about. And the Park Service have been to shake their heads, say yes, but they never really moved towards making it happen.
Maybe that's a project we can collectively engage on to try to make that happen.
It's a good point. The botanical garden, too, is the garden behind the glass.
The Capitol?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
There's several.
St. Louis Arch is partnering now with City Arch River Foundation.
We can talk about that later.
And I'm sorry, there was a question over here.
You had posed the question. I think it's probably more of a management issue because with the sculpture garden, you're on the mall. It's a huge public space. It's managed, 24/7 as a public space, whereas McPherson Square is a bit more isolated in that regard. So it's probably harder to manage.
It's actually surrounded by many, many more people at any given time of day, and
But in terms of staffing it, that would continue more, as a public space.
Can people hear that? The comment is that that a place like the Sculpture Garden basically has people there all the time who are managing it and to a certain extent programming it, whereas a place like McPherson Square.
isn't that just a resource allocation issue, though? I mean, it's not
It
like...
could be. I think it's also, it may be another one of these partnership issues. But I'm sort of curious to know what you would do with a place like McPherson Square if we were able to have, whether or not it was through partnerships or if it was a resource allocation issue with the National Park Service. What if you could sort of snap your fingers and say, I'm going to transform McPherson Square, what would you like to see there?
Well,
Bryant Park.
many things. I mean, Bryant Park isn't far off the mark because it has a lot of different sorts of spaces of different character, but you could, it's a very convivial place to get a coffee or to have lunch. There are tables that, throughout the park that you can enjoy. It's frequently programmed with different sorts of activities, so there's entertainment that's there. You can hear concerts. You can, you can see other types of performances.
Play ping pong.
Absolutely. You can play all kinds of games. It's maintained to a level of, I won't call it perfection, but beautiful plantings, very well maintained. Even the grass very well maintained, which implies a level of resources, that we're not putting into those parks. But I think, if, as the gentleman suggested, we entered into more partnerships. I think the resources exist in the city and among landowners to bring that kind of quality to those parks because they're, the surrounding landowners have every incentive to make them beautiful, well-used, and well-maintained.
Well, and Bryant Park is a perfect example of that because it's a bid and a private corporation. It's not run by the city of New York, and it's really funded by the properties around it.
But you have to be careful as well. And I saw there was a question about Discovery. Discovery has, I don't know if you know this, a very nice park at the back, which they gate off at night, but it has to remain open at certain times of day. They maintain it. They're very diligent about who goes in there. But a couple of years ago, almost 2 years ago, we had the unfortunate hostage situation at Discovery. And there's a daycare there. Part of the public park was taken for a daycare for the tenants or the people at there. And as a result of that, they immediately came in, not that anything happened at the daycare, thankfully, but they came in and they immediately now wanted to create another fence, you know, very high, further back from the fence they'd already built for the kids in the daycare, invading further into the space at the park, and it was going to be a pretty ugly fence. Fortunately, we were able to work with them to get a nice fence with, you know, animals and things and shapes and stuff, and people can still get their arms through, but they can't get through very far. But it did require a lot of work with a private company that was running a public space. So there are challenges that we can't neglect. It's not just with the federal government, it's with other institutions as well that are fairly public.
I'd like to, in the time that we have left, I'd like to touch on a couple of different subjects. Do you find that the new energy codes, the district has requirements for new buildings to be energy efficient, and a lot of the existing federal buildings are being retrofitted, and new ones are being designed to be more environmentally sustainable. Do you think that there's a that the government is becoming more environmentally minded, and is this having a good effect on the community?
All governments or the federal government?
The federal government.
Well, clearly, the federal government is becoming more environmentally minded, and you know, for the sake of the planet, I think that's very good. I think it's also great because they have preferences that apply to their leased space as well, so that becomes influential on the private sector developers and operators of buildings. I mean, it's what some people like to call leadership, to be the entity that goes out there and says, you know, this is the higher level of performance that we want to achieve for ourselves, and maybe we'll set an example for others. And I think GSA, the federal government's been incredibly effective at it. I wish it extended to travel behavior and parking for all the facilities, GSA and others, but I think in terms of the buildings, I think it's been really remarkable.
I actually wrote that question, and I was going more towards a lot of our projects that we do are federal government projects, and there is a drive for them to go towards LEED and doing the LEED campus structure, and they're going for these, like the parking and the bike racks, and I'm just wondering, I know LEED's just an optional program that they can choose to do, although I think all government buildings now have to be at a certain level. I think it's 5. But I saw recently today that the Army is now going away from LEED and going more towards the ASHRAE standard 189 for building efficiency, which is much more stringent than LEED. It doesn't encompass things like site. So I just found that interesting, and I know that the city of Toronto is way ahead of the game. Just found it interesting.
The comment, by the way, was I'm sorry, do you work for a design firm or develop? Yes. Commenting on the fact that a lot of the federal government agencies have been using LEED standards and going for the LEED rating, but some of the Department of Defense agencies seem to be going to the ASHRAE standards, which are more restrictive.
If I could just say, it's interesting, because we also have to think about what this means. The greenest building is?
Existing building.
You know, I'd say St. Louis again, we put 6,000 units in old shoe factories, and I worked out that if we'd knocked them all down, it would have been the equivalent of 5.3 billion aluminum cans going to a landfill. You know, how long do you have to drive a Toyota Prius to make the energy pay off? 27 years. So with all this move to LEED and the other stuff, we have to think about what that does to the existing building stock. And is it forcing more construction at the expense of Class B buildings that could really benefit from these tenants? And in older cities, this is a real challenge. and we have to be aware for that. Just on your last comment about Toronto, you know, one of the things they do there is they draw water in from Lake Ontario that goes into the steam system to air condition the buildings. So when the water goes into the buildings, every building in downtown Toronto, it's already at like 47 degrees. And so these kinds of things help. And it also helps with old buildings, but we have to be careful about what we're doing with the standards with respect to what we've already built.
I would just say that the federal government has done a pretty good job of retrofitting a lot of their existing buildings. That's a lot of what the projects are around, at least around the district. There's some new construction, but most of it is basically an energy efficiency, high-performance retrofit of the existing buildings. And I do agree that that's definitely where we should be starting. But I still quibble, especially with Army, Defense, security-related agencies and their parking. They might build a wonderful green building, even a retrofit, but they still usually have free parking and a lot of it, which again kind of negates the benefit of having a high-performance building if everyone is having to drive to it.
If the most sustainable building is a building that already exists, does that mean that the FBI should stay here?
Needs a lot of work.
But actually, we did get several questions that are basically getting to the point of, would you want the FBI in your community? And basically, if so, where and what sort of guidelines would you want them to follow?
So you and not your economic development director. Is that what?
Yes.
Okay.
So does this mean nobody wants the FBI?
No, we all put up sites for the economic development director to advance. They had some good criteria about distance from transit. I'm assuming they'd build something a little differently from what they have, and I think you could make it work in this environment. I really do. There are some things in the bid, the proposal call that make you believe that they're thinking in the right direction.
And does it include anything like ground floor retail or having?
It might be like the City Hall in Dallas where you can buy a leather holster with the city crest in it.
It might be a ground floor shooting range. I'm not sure.
So I'm sorry, I'm just going through the cards. Roland, here's somebody who has a question about thinking. It says, what would you like the federal government, Maryland DOT, to understand about planning today and for planning for 20 to 30 years in the future? Is
right.
that?
We're very fortunate the Maryland DOT is quite progressive. I really love working with them. It's like the best I've ever worked with. Go to Missouri and, well, the 4-lane road to every community with 5,000 people in it. But the Maryland DOT is terrific. They really, really are terrific. I enjoy working with them. They're great people. And I find, even with the Fed folks, it's going quite well. I'm not sure I'd change too much. The real issues are, maybe I shouldn't say this, are with the local DOT people. And, you go to a meeting and the DOT are blaming it on the SHA guys. You go to the SHA guys, what are you doing? You say, well, we're using their standards. It's like this. Really, the transformation for us has to happen at the local level. And I'm just pulling random questions out of the cards. Harriet, there's a question here about the Banneker Overlook, but I would also be curious to know about the whole effort for the Southeast Eco District that the city has been working on, the small area plan, and been working with the federal government. What do you see as the prospects for actually creating a mixed-use community down there?
They're non-zero. There's a non-zero chance that could happen. I think that when I mentioned one of the things that I'd love to try to correct in our city is to not have these large precincts that are almost entirely federal office space. And this area that's south of Independence, north of Main Avenue, 10th Street, Maryland Avenue, kind of run through them. It's a challenging location, not just because of the uses, but because of the infrastructure and all the different levels. We have CSX train tracks running through, and and it's just very, very difficult to traverse. Some of the other issues, we have the lovely Forrestal building that straddles 10th Street. You know, you go down 10th Street and it's a big wide boulevard and you think you're going somewhere until you get to the end, and there's a nice overlook and a turnaround, but there's no way for you to get down to really to Main Avenue. It's a bit of a gyp for people who are kind of going in that direction now. So I think that there are opportunities in that whole precinct to do something different. We're looking at making some zoning changes, trying to incentivize housing. Should any of those GSA buildings turn over to get more housing in those locations? I think that if the Department of Energy and a couple of other agencies were to make some of those big moves, it really could make an enormous difference, you know, in that location. Many of you know that we have a large development happening at the southwest waterfront, and right now there'd be no way to access it, even though it's really a very short distance from the mall, where we have 16 million tourists come every year. It's really very difficult to get there. So I think the area has a lot of promise, but it would require 2 or 3 big things to happen more or less at the same time. So we've been working on a plan that describes, how we would act and what we might want to change if a couple of those dominoes were to fall.
I'd like to think of that as a model for future government retrofits, and I hope you have luck with whiteout. We're getting to close to 8 o'clock, and I just want to ask if anybody has anything they wanted, any last minute recommendations for the federal government you want to get in there before we close.